Internal Revenue Service IRS Tax News. Small businesses should make sure to use the right form when filing employment tax returns. IRS Tax Tip 2020-173, December 17, 2020. Some small businesses pay employment tax quarterly, while others pay it just once a year. And that'll typically be dependent on how much employment tax you have. If you have more employment tax, then at some point you're going to be having to file quarterly and then having the year-end summary basically filing, that being the 941's quarterly reports and the end of the year, the 940. However, if you're below a certain threshold, you may only need to file the summary at the end of the year as opposed to having the quarterly filing. So normally when you talk to payroll tax professionals, you'll typically hear or think of payroll taxes in terms of having to file the 4 quarters. That would be forms 941. And then the year-end summary is actually a 940, but it's related to the federal unemployment tax as opposed to basically, so it's federal unemployment tax. The others being based in on or focusing in on the Social Security, Medicare, and federal income tax. Also, the names of the forms can be a little bit confusing because you got the forms 941, and then the year-end summary would be a 940 for the federal unemployment tax, and then you got the form 944 for the annual federal tax returns. So the fact that they all start with 9s and 941 and 940, they're all pretty similar in nature, can be a little bit confusing when you're trying to pick the right tax form. You want to pick the right tax form because you don't want to have to get into the issue of messing with payroll taxes or amending payroll taxes. Payroll taxes, typically a thing where you'd like to get it right the first time. It's one of those things where it's better to measure twice, make sure you got the measurement right, and then cut once, because after you cut it, then it takes a long time to fix it if you cut it in the wrong spot, that kind of thing. Anyway, so the IRS advises small business owners to review the rules for filing 2 commonly used employment tax returns. The 2 forms are the Form 941, Employer Quarterly Federal Tax Return, so that would be the quarterly returns, and then the Form 944, Employer's Annual Federal Tax Return. So there's links to those 2 items here if you have questions about them. These 2 forms are not interchangeable. A small business files one or the other. The employer should never flip-flop between the 2 forms on their own and should always file according to the designated filing requirement. So basically the IRS is saying, hey, look, you got to file either quarterly or you got to use the annual one. And these 2 forms are basically separate from the federal unemployment tax, the FUTA tax, which would be the 940, Form 940. And there's rules in terms of when you would need to be filing quarterly, when you would need to be filing annually. And the thought from the IRS's standpoint would be that it's nicer to only have to file annually. So if your payroll tax needs are less, you have less payroll taxes, you're under the threshold, then you would only need to file the 944, the annual filing. And if you're over the threshold, then you have the added burden, in a sense, of having to file quarterly instead of just basically once a year. So here are some more details about these 2 forms. The Form 941, Employer's Quarterly Federal Tax Return. Employers use the Form 941 to report income taxes, Social Security taxes, Medicare taxes, and additional Medicare tax withheld from employees, wages, tips, and other compensation. So the Form 941 is the quarterly form. You have all the federal kind of payroll taxes that are going to be involved, which includes the taxes that are taken out of the employee wages for federal income tax, Social Security, and Medicare, and the employer kind of matching side of Social Security and Medicare. All those are federal taxes, the federal income tax, the Social Security, and the Medicare, but they're different groups of the federal taxes. And remember, when we're talking about federal income tax, we're talking about the federal income tax of the employee that the employer is forced to take out of their paycheck, not the federal income tax that the employer is going to be paying, based on the net income of their business in some way, shape, or form. So then we have to claim employment tax credits and adjustments if there are any tax credits and adjustments. Now, of course, this year there may be some alterations to the 941s due to some of the adjustments that have been made to coincide with the COVID issue this year. So report the amount of employment taxes owed or claim an overpayment of the employment taxes. Now, normally, when you're thinking about the Form 941, it's an informational return, meaning normally what happens is when you run the payroll, you're going to take the money from the employee. You're never going to give it to them, related to the Social Security, Medicare, federal income tax, and then take your portion of the Social Security and Medicare, pay that to the government. So it's already been paid. And then typically when you file the Form 941, you're basically saying, hey, look, this is how much I owed on it, and this is how much I paid. And ideally, those two things match up, and therefore you wouldn't owe anything and you wouldn't get any refund. It's different than a income tax return like a Form 1040. The Form 1040 should be ideally the same kind of process, meaning we pay during the year, which we do, and then it should be an information return saying, hey, look, this is how much we owed, this is how much we paid, and you shouldn't get a refund or any amount due. However, the federal income tax is too complicated to do that because of the progressive tax system and all the different tax deductions you can have. That's why we shoot for a refund. But just note it's a similar process here. The 941 should be basically an informational return due to the fact that the liability has already been incurred and hopefully paid. And then you're going to kind of report it on the 941 to give the double check that that has indeed been done. So if the IRS advises the employer to file Form 941 quarterly, they must do so. So it's not like a voluntary thing. You know, you go over a certain threshold, you can no longer just do an annual filing. You got to do the 941s because the IRS says so. And so that's what you got to do. So Form 944, employer's annual federal tax return. This form is the employers who owe $1,000 or less. So you're under that threshold, $1,000 or less. It allows them to report employment tax liabilities only once a year instead of quarterly. So this is kind of more similar to like an individual income tax reporting, more similar, in other words, to a Form 1040, where you file it basically just annually, once a year. But again, that's if you're under the certain threshold. If you're over a certain threshold, that 1,000, then the IRS typically wants the quarterly filing instead of just simply waiting for the annual filing. So this form can't be used unless the employer receives official IRS notification that they are eligible to use this form. So in essence, the default form, the default payroll process is that you file the Forms 941, the quarterly process, and then you can only use this annual process, the kind of exception to the rule process here, if the IRS explicitly tells you so. So once the employer receives notice they can file Form 944, they must file this form every year. They must continue to file Form 944 regardless of the tax they owe unless the IRS notifies them differently. So once the IRS says, hey, you're on the 944 process, you're filing annually, then the IRS will notify you to basically stop the 944 process. So hopefully that will alleviate the worry of having to say, well, I don't know if the payroll is going to be over the threshold and having to check it all the time. The IRS should notify you in that instance. So that's kind of nice. So if a taxpayer is not sure which form they should file, they can call the IRS at 800-829-4933 or 267-941-1000. And so if you're in that, and I would think that would be the situation, either you haven't filed payroll before and you want to know, what you're going to be filing in that situation, or if you're in a situation where you were filing the Form 944 and possibly your payroll liabilities have gone up, and you're concerned maybe that you missed the letter or something from the IRS as to switching to the 941 process, then that might be instances where you want to contact the IRS and get it straightened out. It's worthwhile usually to get the payroll straightened out again and do it, measure twice, cut once with the payroll. It's not one of those things that you just want to shoot at the dartboard until you get closer to the middle, because takes a lot of time oftentimes to amend or fix payroll problems. So it's better to fix them first. So the more slow process of getting it done right is usually better than the trial and error process for payroll oftentimes. So more information can be found on Form 941 instructions, Form 944 instructions, Publication 15 on Circular E, Employer's Tax Guide. And there's a YouTube item here for some taxpayers can file their employment tax annually as well. There's links to those items here. There'll be a link to this in the description.